Welcome to the Cabrera Lab Podcast.
Hey.
Hello.
How are you?
Kicking butt.
I, too, am kicking butt today, so we're in good shape to have a podcast because we're both kicking butt.
Nice.
All right, so listen. There's this sort of age-old debate across the disciplines, but in particular, the other day I was listening to, I don't know, I think it's like a YouTube video of a conference talk, and somebody was arguing about pragmatism. Mm-hmm. And the person was saying that if you're really a pragmatist, that pragmatism doesn't really need theory, that that it's just that you can make a lot of decisions not with any theoretical underpinning, or I don't know. I just thought theory versus practice, pragmatism, like we should talk about that because it's an interesting ongoing conversation that keeps coming up.
I mean, the first part is, by and large, writ large, people don't understand what theory is.
Okay.
If you listen to the way the word theory is used in casual conversation, if it's used at all,
yeah,
they'll say, well, oh, that's just a theory. That, I have a theory on this. Or, people use it very loosely as a word.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between a guess, an opinion, a hypothesis, a theory.
Yeah.
Those couldn't be more different, right? So a theory, probably the most important aspect of a theory, means that it has accumulated evidence.
Okay.
So a theory is a hypothesis that has accumulated evidence, so much so that it becomes a theory. So a theory is like the gold standard of science. A theory is like really something you should take seriously if it's an actual theory. Now, the problem is a lot of people call things theories that aren't theories.
Right.
But if something's an actual theory in science, it means that it's like the real deal. Like you should definitely practice based on it.
Meaning it's been tested, it's been really empirically looked at, validated, or rejected.
Yes.
Right.
Well, it wouldn't be a theory if it was rejected.
Right.
But in other words, if something is truly a theory, now that doesn't help people with the problem that sometimes people call things theories when they're not theories.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But if something is legitimately a scientific theory, it is by definition something that is supported by an accumulation of evidence, like not just one evidence, a bunch of evidence.
So like proven, it's proven. Like
scientists don't use the word proven, but to the general public, it's effectively proven. Yeah.
So like the theory of evolution.
Yeah,
the theory of gravity.
Theory of relativity. Yeah, gravity. Those are all theories. Yeah.
So if you think of it that way, then when I say I have a theory about the dog, well, I don't actually have.
You have an opinion.
I have an
about
opinion
the dog.
Or a guess, or
you have an opinion or a guess. If that thing is testable, mm-hmm. meaning there's some way to actually verify it, then you're starting into the realm of a hypothesis.
Right.
But an opinion doesn't have to be testable. I can have any opinion I want.
Yeah.
I can say I can have an opinion that your shirt is purple. That's my opinion, or blue, or pink, or whatever. I can have any opinion that I want.
Yeah, that's right.
And what a lot of people in academia, not in science, but in academia, when they are talking, a lot of times they're talking opinion.
Yes.
And they're pretending that it's theory.
Right, and they're doing that to have credibility. They're using the word theory to be credible.
Yeah, and whether or not they intend to or not, sometimes they very clearly intend to, and sometimes they just aren't paying attention. It's a rhetorical technique to try to get credibility.
Right.
It's manipulative. So we're talking about things as if they are credible science when they are, in fact, somebody's opinion. Yeah. And this happens a lot in the field of systems thinking.
Why so much in the field of systems thinking, do you think?
Well, I think it happens a lot in all fields where the maturity of the field isn't there yet, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
Physics has the benefit of it has longevity and maturity, And also, part of that longevity and maturity is because it is simpler. The things that they're studying are simpler. I know that sounds weird to people because in high school, when you take physics, it's hard. It doesn't seem simpler.
Yeah.
In high school, when you take,
chemistry,
I don't know, history, it's easier. Or if you take sociology in high school or college, it's perceived to be an easier course.
Yeah.
And so we don't think of that as being the harder thing as being simpler. But if you think about the things that physicists study and the phenomena that chemists study, those phenomena are much simpler as systems.
Are they simpler because they're observable and they're known, or what makes them simpler?
They're simpler because, in a technical sense, they're simpler in that they don't have as many degrees of freedom. They don't have as many, variables involved. They don't have as many, they don't have things that have agency or a tremendous amount, the degree to which those things have agency. So, for example, literally, as soon as you enter organic, biological species into the mix, the complexity just goes through the roof, right? And in fact, even in physics and chemistry, when there's a thing called a 3-body problem or a 2-body problem, as soon as you go above three things, the complexity involved just goes through the roof. And then if you then add that those 3 things have some semblance of, awareness or consciousness or agency or choice, then the number of variables just goes up. And then the number of interactions, it's just things get much more complex.
Interesting. So you were talking about systems thinking as a field has a tendency to have less theory.
Almost no theory.
And more sort of
opinion.
Or
what a lot of people call published papers. I feel for folks when they try to come to these things and try to sift through and understand the wheat from the chaff and separate the wheat from the chaff in some of these academic disciplines, especially some that are relatively new and or studying relatively complex things, right? Not unimportant things, right? Like happiness is an incredibly important thing to study.
Yeah.
Why are people happy or not happy?
Right.
That doesn't make it an easy thing to study, right? Empathy, an incredibly important thing to study. Doesn't make it easy to study. It's very complex. First of all, it's complex because of all the things I mentioned. But second, it's complex because it's predominantly invisible. If I can look at a molecule and I can actually see the molecule under a microscope.
Right.
Well, gosh, that takes half the battle out of it. I can see the thing.
You can observe it.
I can observe it. It's not as easy to observe empathy.
No.
So studying it is just harder.
Yeah.
It's harder. It's more complex to study empathy than it is to study molecules. In the same way that it's more complex to study interactions than it is to study sheep.
Right.
It's more complex to study marriage than it is to study husbands.
Right.
Right? Because the marriage is kind of like a husband. I can go, there's a husband, right.
Because there's so many interactions.
Right? Like marriage, like where is it? Yeah. Where's a marriage?
Right.
How do you find it? How do you isolate it? How do you measure it?
It's an invisible
You can't even see it.
Yeah.
We all know it exists. We all know that it's a relational thing. We all know that it has certain components. But how do you see it? You're starting off with a much more difficult problem because it's barely visibly observable, right? Yeah. So you can observe it. You can sit like Jane Goodall and watch married people. You can observe it, but you can't see it.
Yeah.
Right? You can't touch it. Well, right. I can touch, a slime mold. I can touch a pond. I can go and sit next to a pond and study the pond ecology.
Right.
I can't see the relationships that are happening. That's a little more difficult.
So in systems thinking, does that follow then that mechanical systems versus organic systems, socio-technical systems? Is
Sure.
that why? Is that possibly one of the reasons that you see more opinion than you do theory in the field? Is it that these systems are involving humans and interactions or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex thing with the why. Why do we see more? But yes, I mean, generally speaking, they're more complex, right? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of disciplines, the social disciplines, the social sciences, they're more complex. There are certainly things in those sciences that are less complex and that we study quite well. Like in sociology, we are quite good at network theory, but that's because we can count the nodes and we can count the relationships. We can literally say, does this person know this person? And at that simple level, we can do a lot with network theory. But at a more complex level, we don't know what's happening in the relationships at a more kind of, does this person really like this person, or are they just
I mean, we know there's a relationship.
We know there is a relationship, but we don't know the details at the marriage level or at the friendship level. That's a lot. If you're trying to study, are people friends? And friends is determined, the construct of friends is determined on whether you're connected on Facebook. Well, that's a much easier thing to count than are they friends? Like, do they like each other? Do they trust each other? Are they vulnerable with each other? Are they, do
they even see each other?
Do they even see each other in person? Do they, are they fond of each other? Would they support each other? All that kind of stuff. Well, that's a lot harder to determine.
Yeah.
In a lot of disciplines, systems thinking included, it's more complex. It's younger. The field itself is younger than sort of some of these older fields. Mm-hmm. It draws less technical people, so less people that get into the technica of it. Mm-hmm. Those are some of the reasons. There's other reasons that have to do with cultural norms in science and things like that. But
I mean, it gets back to what I was thinking about earlier is, we were signing up for a conference. It was a systems thinking conference, one of the first ones I went to. And I remember when I signed up or registered for the conference, it had a checkbox. Are you a theorist? Are you a practitioner? Are you a student? And you and I have talked about theory and practice. Mm-hmm. It always strikes me when people sort of say you're either a theorist or a practitioner, but you're never both, or that they're not related. Like the whole idea of pragmatism doesn't require any theory.
There couldn't be more bullshit than that. That couldn't be a more bullshit statement.
Technical term.
Kurt Lewin was famous for saying there's nothing more practical than a good theory. And again, if you think theory is an opinion, or theory is a guess, or theory is a hypothesis, well, then that's not what theory means. There is nothing more practical than a good theory. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is a good theory is reality. It's the closest thing we have to reality, period. It's the closest thing that science has to reality. It's the closest thing that science has to proven. We don't use the word proven, but that's, if we did, that would be the closest thing that we'd have. So what is more practical than knowing how reality works?
Maybe for the audience's sake, it might be helpful if instead of saying proven, you say the best approximation of reality that we have at this moment. Yeah. Right? So a theory is...
It's the truest things that we have.
In terms of approximating the reality of whatever it is you're measuring or studying or...
Yeah, I mean, like sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, well, evolution, it's just a theory. And you're like, what? What does that mean? That's so crazy. Right? You're like, no, yes, evolution is a theory. Mm-hmm. And not just a theory. It's the reason that tomatoes look the way they do in the grocery store. Like it couldn't get any more pragmatic. Like you would not have the tomatoes that you get in the grocery store, or the oranges, or the 20 different kinds of apples. You wouldn't have the apples that are this big. You wouldn't have tomatoes that are tasteless and this big. You wouldn't have all that kind of stuff, right? There's some negatives. But the reason we have that is because of evolution, our understanding of evolution, our understanding of genetics. That's why we have that. Our understanding of breeding.
What if you said, oh, relativity, it's just a theory?
Then you wouldn't get, rockets, and we wouldn't have any successful stuff happening in space. We wouldn't have, I mean, that's what I mean. There's just certain things that relativity makes possible.
Yes.
There's certain things that evolution and genetics makes possible. There's certain things that these theories make possible. And without them, you wouldn't be able to calculate certain things. You wouldn't be able to, there's a bunch of stuff you wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah.
So it's wildly pragmatic.
Well, then that
And by the way, coming up with a theory that doesn't do anything in reality, it's hard to even imagine what that would look like, but because you wouldn't get any accumulated evidence if it wasn't based in reality.
Right.
Right. So practice is reality. On the flip side of the coin, so that's why practitioners and practice shouldn't misunderstand theory, because it's like absolutely the most important thing to them. And by the way, theorists should not, I mean, I don't know why a theorist would ever do that, because a theorist is really interested in how does reality work.
Yeah, but I do think in academia in particular, I came up through translational research and all of that. There is this very interesting separation of theory and practice, and then it's considered to be an enormous skill to bridge them, which is interesting if you think about it. But
again, that's because people are coming up with theories. You don't come up with a theory.
Right.
You come up with a framework. You come up with a model. You come up with a hypothesis. And then evidence either accumulates for those things or it doesn't. And if it does, then that thing becomes a theory. Right. It is the act of accumulated evidence that turns something into a theory.
Right.
It's not the act of thinking it. Right. It's the act of accumulation of evidence that turns it into a theory.
Yes, I agree with that. But I think even taking that further, even a theory that is a viable theory, as you're saying, your definition of theory, I still think there's a tendency to have, for example, the theorist camp kind of poo-poos practitioners, and that practitioner camp kind of poo-poos theorists as being like absurd. Not practical. Yeah. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why is that the case, and how do we get people to see what you just said, which is there's nothing more practical than a good theory, and how do we create that bridge sort of naturally rather than believing that we have to physically do that?
Yeah, I mean, in order to look for patterns across multiple practical domains, multiple practical situations. So you might have like something happens over here in practice, this domain, this is a bunch of situations that happen in the real world. And what a theory is going to try to do, if this is the theory, is kind of look at the pattern across all these and sort of look at how can I explain all these different things that are happening in this world, in this pragmatic, practical world. And what is the pattern that connects them, right? What is the pattern across them? And then I'm going to come up with, something that says what the pattern that connects them is. And that thing can feel kind of abstract because you're thinking, this is A and this is B and this is C and this is D, and A is not B, is not C, is not D, so those are different situations. But actually, there's a pattern across them. So if you're thinking about leadership, which is a very complex realm that we don't fully understand, but, leader A is not leader B, is not leader C, is not leader D. And, when you look at leader A, you go, what's leader A doing? Oh, they're like this. And B is totally different than A. And C is totally different than A and B. And so you just go, God, there's just no way to know what good leadership is. And then somebody goes, wait a minute, is A different than B? Maybe the surface level actions are different, but the underlying pattern of their behavior and the pattern of the reaction that it creates to that behavior is very, very similar to B. And if you start to see that underlying structure, that underlying pattern, then you can start to come up with a model that describes that. And then once you come up with a model, you can test the model. And then once a bunch of people test that model, then that thing becomes, if tested, and if you get an accumulation of evidence, you get reality. You get a theory that is based on reality.
Does that mean that?
But that's very different from another method, which is I'm Joe Schmo, and I look for 10 minutes or 10 years on this thing, and I go, I think it's this. Mm-hmm. I think what's happening is X equals PDQ.
Yeah.
And you go, okay, it's true. X equals PDQ. No evidence, no nothing. That is not called a theory. That's called Joe's opinion. Mm-hmm. Right? Here's Joe, and here's Joe's opinion, and everybody has them. Everybody has opinions.
I see.
Because it hasn't been tested. That's not very pragmatic. That's just Joe's opinion. That's Joe's opinion, his anecdotal experience of what leadership is.
This episode is sponsored by Training Camp, the ultimate online spot for building the mental fitness that drives personal and professional change and success. At Training Camp, you'll have access to the science and practice of thinking with personalized thinking assessments, tiered training, and best of all, practice that improves skill. Go to cabreralab.org to learn more. And now, back to the episode.
Does that mean then when you talk about pragmatism or pragmatics, that sort of lives at the surface level and doesn't actually see the hidden patterns and structures underneath? Is that a fair statement? Or
no? I think people that are really excellent practitioners. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of people that come from the practice world eventually they're thinking about it so much and they're watching it and they have so much experience that they eventually go, I really want to go study this. I want to go figure out what are the underlying patterns because nobody's figured it out yet. And then they go and they're the ones that oftentimes create theories.
I see.
To create things that get tested enough to be theories.
And should we as academics be really trying to understand the difference between theory and practice, but also push ourselves to see the patterns and actually build that bridge, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know this because you're actually trained in this. So, but the relationship between theory and practice a lot of times is this thing called translational research. And the reason that translational research is so important is because theory and practice is so important. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times when somebody's come up with a theory and it's been tested and it's been accumulation of evidence has occurred, you really want the practical world to know about it because we now know that to be mostly true, But, the practical world has its head in the details of what's going on and, isn't studying the, whatever abstract level of it. And so you need kind of a translatory or translator to sort of say, hey, when we say F equals MA, here's what it means in reality. Here's what that looks like in reality.
Right.
Right. The problem is when we go evolutionary theory and the practitioners, meaning the general public in this case, let's say, they say, well, what's evolutionary theory? And we go, well, it means we came from monkeys. Mm-hmm. And you go, I don't think we came from monkeys. And then you have a big argument about that. Evolutionary theory doesn't say that.
Right.
Evolutionary theory, that's a mistranslation.
Right.
Evolutionary theory says that monkeys and us had a common ancestor.
Right.
Who's no longer on the planet.
Right.
That species is gone.
Yeah.
That's what evolutionary theory says. But people take it as, you mean, there was a monkey and then I became a human out of the monkey? I don't think that's what happened. And you're like, neither does Darwin.
Right. So it seems to me that part of the challenge is actually in not misinforming the public. I do know in conversation over and over again, people say, I have a theory about this. I have a theory about that. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah.
I think one of the other challenges is, I don't know how we do it, but getting people to see the real necessary connection between theory and practice.
Yes.
Because otherwise you get statements like a pragmatist doesn't actually need to know anything about theory.
If there's a theory in the realm that they're in, they definitely do. That'd be about the only thing that they definitely should know. Now, that doesn't mean that thing is primed to be known. That's a different problem in science. We should work more on making sure that the public gets the benefit of science. right? And part of that is translating it well so that the public can understand the science, right?
Yeah.
Evolutionary theory is a great case of that because, most of the arguments that are made against evolutionary theory are just abominations they're straw men
Of the theory.
There's,
Right.
the idea of a straw man versus a steel man.
Yeah.
A straw man is like, I take your argument. We do this we humans do this to other
Not you and
humans.
me.
No, not you and you. But we humans do this to other humans all the
Yeah.
time. So the person goes, well, I think this. And you go, you think that,
Yeah.
all puppies are ugly, and you're like, I didn't say all puppies are ugly.
But now you're arguing about it.
Right? So that's called a straw man,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What you want to do is deal with the steel man, the thing behind the theory that is, a real representation of the theory, not a fictitious,
Scarecrow.
of the made out of straw of the theory. So we have to get better at translating into practitioner language or practice domain the importance of those theories. Because frankly, everything else really isn't important.
Okay, let's slow down there.
Everything else is just like anecdotal experience.
Oh, I see what you mean.
I'm not saying anecdotal experience isn't important. I'm just saying it's not something that I would bet the farm on.
Right.
Right? Just because Joe down the hall says this is the way to do it. I wouldn't bet the farm on that.
Yeah.
But I'd bet the farm on gravity. I'd bet the farm on relativity. I'd bet the farm on evolution.
Right.
Those are theories.
I mean, but I also think you said it's about making sure that we take the responsibility to translate theories into practice. And I think it's also a wider context. I mean, you and I talk about this a lot, a wider context of just general education of for example, the difference between a hypothesis, a test, a theory, all of those different components of what people have different meanings for, and they associate it with science.
Yeah.
Right? I think there's a huge context in
Even
which...
the notion of science.
Right.
We have such a huge misunderstanding of science. Mm-hmm. And science is one of our, if not the most important way of knowing that we've ever invented.
Right.
It's the most important way that we've ever invented of knowing things. And we've confused it almost entirely with academia, which is a political, cultural, social, human system that is basically, it's quite literally no different in all of its complexity than politics or office politics or anything else. Like academia and academicians and the publisher-perish game, it's its own thing that does not necessarily have to do with science. Sometimes science is co-located with it.
Right.
But, there's science happening, lots of remarkable science happening in academia and not in academia.
Yes.
And there's also all kinds of crazy shenanigans going on inside of academia that shouldn't taint our love of science.
Well, I think the first thing is distinguishing between the two.
Yeah, just make it just understand them as being
science.
different.
I also think, and this struck me as a young PhD student many years ago. I was always baffled by why academics did not write their ideas to be understood. Right? There was this trend, at least when I was a student, where people really wrote. Academic writing was very dense. It was very hard to understand, and it almost seemed purposeful. And I think part of it is we have to get over our egos. I don't think the smartest person in the room has the least understandable piece of written work. I think actually the smarter people in the room have all of that in their minds, but have a way of actually communicating it to be understood. That to me is a smart person, because then I'm adding to the knowledge outside of myself.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons for that. One is in science sometimes you're getting more detailed and more technical, and so you're making more distinctions. You're parsing fine-grained distinctions, just like a surgeon is making very fine-grained cuts or whatever. That's a surgeon's different than like somebody cutting up meat with a cleaver. Those are different levels, different grain analysis. So there is a reasonable amount of technical language, and that's not just in science. I mean, that's in engineering. That's in go to business. Go in the military and think of all the acronyms and technical language they use. In all these different areas, if you walked into a room that you were unfamiliar with and they were working at a high level in whatever area, not just science, they would be using a whole host of terminology that you would have no idea what they were saying.
Yeah.
Right? In business, in military, in engineering, and in science. The other side is there absolutely is has been and is a culture of writing in ways that are not for the reader. They're not easily understood.
Yeah.
And I would even go so far as to say that in certain sciences or certain academic disciplines, rather, it becomes almost, you create an impenetrable wall of words because maybe underneath those words, there's really nothing there. And so you have to create the illusion that this thing, it's not that there's nothing there. It's just silly me, can't understand it. And then the reader just thinks, this is like above my head. When really it's actually just a cloud of cloudiness and words play that means absolutely nothing.
It's like a moat to protect that person's expertise.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Because I want to be the expert in something.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think it's impossible. I do think the culture of academia can change. I do think the public's understanding of the value of what science is and the value of it can change.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, the general public pays to know things. Mm-hmm. Right? They pay with their tax dollars.
Yeah.
So they pay for science. So science owes them good explanations.
Right.
Good, usable explanations. There's the edifice of academia. And I should probably draw that differently, right? So because science is happening inside and outside of academia. So, maybe it's like this, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, science is happening outside of academia. Science is happening inside of academia. Mm-hmm. But science is not the same as academia.
Right.
And a scientist is not the same as an academic.
Right.
Right? The public should make that distinction. Mm-hmm. It's really important that when they see a gross example of irresponsible, quote-unquote, science, they should distinguish between, is that academic shenanigans or is that science?
Right.
If you make that distinction, it can make things a lot easier to sort of not lose faith in this absolutely remarkable tool that we've created called science.
Right.
Which is absolutely, it's literally like, knowledge, real knowledge about the real universe, and not just crazy things, not just like big esoteric things about the universe, which is cool too. Yeah. But like really pragmatic things about the universe. Things that make everything run.
Yeah.
Things that make it so you can have a phone and communicate to your loved ones. And so this thing, science, boy, it is a national treasure. It's it is something we do not want to conflate and lose faith in. It's so important. And we scientists have to get better at making sure the public understands the science. And the public deserves to understand the science because they paid for it.
Well, it's not just because they're paid. Yes, they paid for it, but also, in terms of our outcomes as a society, as a country, the more educated...
Totally, yeah.
I don't mean formally educated.
Yeah.
The more we know, the more we know, more learned. I don't mean formal education.
Yes, absolutely.
They're
not always correlated.
No.
Learned and education level may be very far from each other.
Yeah.
Again, another really important distinction to make is level of education is not the same as learned or knowledgeable. Those could be the same or they could be very, very different.
Yeah. I think we need to do a podcast just on societal widespread distinction errors. Like where we conflate
conflation.
Terms. Yeah.
Conflation is something that's very important, and distinction, identity, other is not list move, which is one of the moves that we talk about, is a very, very effective tool to say, wait a minute, like is learned or knowledgeable the same as educated? Is education the place we go to learn? Sometimes, and sometimes it's not.
Right.
Right? Meaning the schools and the buildings and all that stuff. Is that the only place we can learn? No. Most of our learning happens outside of those places. And if we have letters after our name, or if we have degrees of XYZ types, does that mean we're learned and knowledgeable, or does it just mean we got more formal education?
Well,
and
or
are
we
they
were
the
lucky
same thing?
and had the opportunity.
Whatever.
I think about that a lot.
Absolutely.
I meet people all the time that are incredibly sharp and just didn't have the means or the opportunity
For sure.
to go and get a formal education. So, back to where we started.
Yeah.
I think we should really think more, and maybe we should write a paper on theory versus practice, because it's not theory versus practice.
It really isn't. They're hand in glove, or two sides of the same coin is probably the best way to think about it. Like, you can't have a coin that has one side and doesn't have the other. I guess if it was just like two-dimensional, you could, but
That's too much.
it's too much. But
We understood you.
Yeah, you can't.
You need one to have the other.
You need one to have the other, and theory and practice are like they're lovers. They love each other. They should love each other. They should be best friends.
Yeah.
They should not be separate.
Hand in hand,
walking down the street.
Yeah.
And translational research is a really important field that, because of that translatory nature, and it goes both ways, right? The practitioners have to communicate, hey, we're really having this problem. Like, what could be some of the solutions? We've been watching what's happening, and we think it's this. How would we test that so that we can find out if what we think has validity?
Yeah.
How would we go about testing that? And that's the beautiful love relationship between theory and practice.
Yeah.
There's nothing more practical than a good theory.
Yeah.
All right. That's a wrap.